So I was treating someone who had a needle phobia recently, and this person really felt trapped by authority figures that were medical, and this person had their reasons for it. And so the first thing I did, because we were working with this needle, was say, you're going to practice getting the hell out of here. So I'll come at you, I'll come at you with this needle, I don't have a needle, but we'll pretend I do. Okay, so I'm going to move it towards you, and you're going to tell me to stop, and you're going to leave the room, because you want to see that you can. And the person will think, well, I know I can. It's like, no, you don't know. You don't know. And so we're going to practice it just like a kid pretending. And so I move forward with the non-existent needle, and they say stop, and I stop, and they say I'm leaving, and they leave. And they come back and they're smiling because they didn't know they could do that. And part of them is still thinking, well, I'm a 4-year-old kid and there's no way I can get out of here. No one's going to listen to me. It's built right into them. That's like Freudian regression or fixation at an earlier developmental stage. And if you watch for that in people, sometimes you can see how old they are. If you tap into something that they were afraid of very young, their whole facial expression will turn into that person, their body language and everything. It's very interesting. You have to watch very carefully to see it, but you can definitely see it. So with the agoraphobic, you think, well, you treat the agoraphobic, and then she can go take taxis and she can go on the subway, and then she goes and has a big fight with her husband because she should have had one 20 years ago, but she was dependent and authority seeking, so she never would risk it, because if she upset the relationship with authority, then it would expose her to the world. And so she was always in a subordinate and inferior position and a bit of a slave. And one of the things that often happens when you treat someone with agoraphobia is they get a lot more assertive. And you think, well, one of the things the psychoanalysts objected to when the behaviorists started to use exposure therapy as a treatment was the idea that there would be substitution, because the psychoanalysts would say, you're not really afraid of an elevator. So if I just treat your elevator fear, because that's really not what you're afraid of, the fear is just going to pop up somewhere else. That'd be symbolic substitution. But that isn't what happened. What happened is that if they learned to get on the elevator, they're much more likely to take a taxi. You think, well, why is that? It's because they weren't learning that things were less frightening. That was the original idea. The original idea was counter-conditioning, that basically the person had been conditioned to be afraid of whatever it was, and then what you did was you put them in encounter with that, and you let them breathe and relax, and then the relaxation they learned would counteract the panic, and that's why exposure therapy worked. But it turned out you didn't need to do any of that. It wasn't counter-conditioning at all. And so then you think, well, it's fear reduction or habituation. That was the next theory. Habituation is just, if you take a snail, he comes out of his shell, you poke him, he goes into a shell, and then he comes out again, poke him. It's how you tease a snail if you ever need to know that. So he comes out, you tap him, and you do that 10 or 15 times, the snail gets bored, and you tap him, he just sits there. Now, he doesn't get bored because snails are probably always bored, but what's happened is that in some sense, you've exhausted the nervous system representation. That's one way of thinking about it. Or you can think about it as a very simple form of learning. That's habituation. You learn to ignore. And the idea then for a while was that you were teaching people to habituate to these things they were afraid of. But that also turned out not to be true. What you're actually doing is teaching the person to be brave. And that generalizes. So what happens is, they think they're all pathetic and fear-ridden and tiny and vulnerable and useless, and so they're acting like that, and then you say, well, look, this is a horrible thing you've got here. Why don't we see if you can manage it? And so they go through it and they think, wow, I could do that. Ha! I'm not as useless as I thought. And then maybe they try 20 things like that and they think, wow, I'm a lot tougher than I knew I was. Maybe they stand up a little bit straighter because they're a little more dominant and their serotonin systems start to work again. And then they're ready to take on the world more. And so maybe that's why they go home and have a fight with their stupid husband. And that doesn't necessarily make him very happy either. And that would be an example of psychotherapeutic resistance from a family member. Do you really want your person to be better? Right? If they're a little more assertive and a little less fearful, you might not be able to tyrannize over them so easily. And so it's not necessarily the case at all that you would be happy about that. So you got to watch that sort of thing too. And maybe the person wouldn't even be that happy about it because they're getting all sort of secondary benefits from being, neurotic and martyred, because that's a vicious weapon. To be weak and useless, if you can wield that as a weapon, it's extraordinarily effective. So you got to watch for that sort of thing to be working against your psychotherapeutic aims as well.
you.